Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, or indeed good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining us from today. A very warm welcome to the University of Tasmania online series for Alumni Explore. Firstly, as a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, and custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Kate Robertson, and I'm the Executive Director of Advancement. And within my portfolio, I have the very great privilege of having oversight of our Alumni Relations Programme. And it's a particular joy in my role to connect with so many people, both here in Tasmania, interstate, and all around the world, and hear your stories and your interests in maintaining your link to the university. This series, Explore, provides an opportunity specifically for you, alumni of the University of Tasmania, for advancement and inspiration, and I hope very much that you will find that to be the case this afternoon. One of the greatest advantages of being a member of the alumni community is the ability to tap into a group of influential individuals with a vast global impact and really have the opportunity to connect with each other and tap into that expertise and experiences of people from all over the world, all with that shared experience of being a member of the alumni community. You're such an important part of the fabric of this university, and that's why we're providing opportunities to access webinars tailored to your needs and interests. And this has been designed very much with the focus and feedback that we've had from alumni in the past. So we hope you enjoy yourselves this afternoon. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get underway. Your microphone, camera, chat function, and raised hand function have all been disabled in order that when our guest is speaking, she's not interrupted. But we do encourage you to ask questions, and you can do that by typing them into the Q&A function that you can see on your screen. We have had some questions submitted in advance, and thank you to those who have done that. That's always really helpful. We may not get to answer all of the questions that come in today, but I will do my very best. And if I can see that there's a theme emerging between the questions that we receive, I will group them together and put those to Suellen so we can try and get through as many as possible. And finally, this In Conversation is being recorded for later access on our YouTube channel. But on to the main business of today. We're very lucky to be joined by an alumna of the University of Tasmania who is in charge, who is a change and organisational development specialist who will provide insights into the different ways people frame and react to change, including the helpful and sometimes unhelpful way that human instincts play out during times of upheaval. She'll also offer practical tools for managing emotional responses to change and adapting to difference and disruption within the workplace and beyond. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Suellen Taylor. Suellen is a highly experienced strategic human resources professional who over the last 15 years has specialised in organisational leadership and cultural development and alignment. She brings a creative and outcomes-based approach to a wide range of projects and workplaces, and her passion for what she does has been described as unfaltering. Tertiary qualified in behavioural science from the University of Tasmania and with a master's in business psychology from the University of Newcastle. She's certified in several diagnostic tools. She has worked with a wide range of people leaders in the private, not-for-profit and government sectors and brings to an audience practical wisdom based on the lessons of experience. I think you're going to experience that for yourself right now. So without further ado, let me hand over to you, Suellen.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much. And welcome to everybody. And thank you for spending time with us today. And an early shout out to the alumni team for helping in getting this ready together. So without any further delay, I will go through and share my screen. And I'd like to, I suppose, echo Kate's thoughts around the questions. So happy to sort of take questions at the end. So please, if something is raised for you, make sure that you pop it in the Q&A section. So navigating change, it's definitely an interesting topic. It's always a hot topic. And what I'd like to go through today is thinking about that sort of how we frame change, looking at the transition curve. But in particular today, change is such a huge subject, and to condense it into something quite small, what I'd like to do is actually look at it through the lens of human instincts and a framework called Hardwired Humans, and I'll talk more about that. And as Kate was saying, you know, a tool to sort of identify and manage some emotional responses, and sort of some tips to work through uncertainty. So that's really what we'll go through today. But I suppose before we sort of start talking more detailed about change at a very sort of top level, there's a couple of different kinds of change, some that we've all experienced, and that's the idea of plan changed, which is sort of, you know, much easier to get your head around. You know, there's an organisational focus to this, but it could be things like moving house, planned retirement, those kind of things. But then in also life, there's the unplanned change, and of course, our most recent example of that was COVID, and you know, pandemics, as we've got one. You know, sudden loss, regulatory change can come into place, competition, employee movement, those kind of things. So sometimes, and the spring's there because it's I suppose the tension of the two, because you can plan stuff, but even within the planning, there is always the unplanned. So that's the first tip for change, is that always plan for the unexpected, or expect the unexpected. And I just wanted to bring up this concept of VUCA, and I know some people have heard of it and some it may be new to you, but change can be highly disruptive, and the idea is that, you know, it can create a perceived threat state in the brain, particularly if it's continuous and we're sort of it's coming towards us. We're feeling like we don't have the capacity to sort of deal with it at that moment in time, which means that, you know, the change can sort of hijack the brain's attention. And when we feel uncertain and helpless and overwhelmed, our cognitive function can be impaired. And I suppose coping is the conscious and unconscious efforts we put in to solve problems and reduce stress. And I suppose it's the mind's built-in troubleshooting program, and we cope in different ways. And I think the most important thing is that individuals cope in different ways. And as we sort of take on those coping mechanisms, sometimes it's about problem solving, sometimes it can be avoidant. But how, as I was saying, you know, how people cope is also very individual. But what we need to look at is, when do those coping mechanisms become maladaptive, or sort of, you know, they're getting us further away from where we actually need to be. So I think that's sort of one of the key things that we need to ask ourselves during change, and as sort of things come towards us, it's going, is what I'm doing now getting me closer to or further away the end state where I want to be? So, you know, when we talk about processes like having some quiet time, that's fine. But if we sort of start to get withdrawn, then that's when we're sort of starting to get into that zone of, I think I need some help. So, you know, the coping mechanism becomes maladaptive. Or humour, you know, is another one. It might be, you know, let's just have a joke about this. You know, if I didn't laugh, I'd cry. But, you know, sometimes that can move into, you know, just sort of takes nothing seriously. So it's always really important, particularly, you know, in change where you're with other team members or family members and things like that, is to kind of have a look at, I suppose, the escalation of those kind of coping strategies. Now, one of the things I hear, particularly working in the field of change and organisational behaviour, is people don't like change. And so normally when I run a session, it's really quite interactive. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll stick in a poll here. And so what I'd like to do is put it out to participants today and sort of viewers today. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? So I believe we're going to send you through a poll to be able to answer that. So you've got two choices: agree or disagree with that statement.
Quite a big question, Suellen, isn't it?
It is a very big question.
Simple answer, but it's a big question.
That's it. Well, I hear it all the time. You know, people agree or disagree with change. And I'm not sure, I'm not seeing the responses.
All right.
I think we might be sharing them.
All right. Can you see those now?
Yes, I can. Thank you. So, yep. So more people agree than disagree. Yeah. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask that question again, but I'm going to be a little kinder and I'm going to give you another response. So maybe if we can put out the question again with a third response variable, that would be great. There you go. And that probably doesn't surprise anybody. It certainly doesn't surprise me because it's a question I ask all the time. And so I suppose as a change agent, a change and sort of working with change, is that I hear people say it all the time like it's this categorical fact. Whereas, if it's categorical agree, it's right or it's wrong, then there's a lot of people who say it depends. And when I've run these sort of workshops before and had these conversations, the most common responses that people give for what does it depend upon is, first of all, the sense of agency. So what is the capacity and the conditions for me to be able to respond? So people tend to not necessarily like it, but they're more inclined to get on board and accept the possibility that things could be different if there is a sense of agency. Also, too, was it initiated by the person? So, did I invoke this change or was it forced upon me? And of course, when it's somebody leading the change, such as it was my choice to move house, move job, do whatever, then, retire, then that's sort of, it also is that sense of agency. The other thing, another common response is around autonomy. So the freedom to act is like, what are my choices within this? And of course, the other one that comes up is trust. So, it's the sense of trust either in the organisation, and sometimes that trust is within self. Can I cope? And we'll sort of look at that in a moment when we talk about that appraisal system. But, trust is also moderated by the person whose interest is being acted upon. So hang on, is this in my best interest or their best interest, or is that person acting in good faith? So they seem to be the top four things. There's a range of others, and happy for people to kind of add some comments or any other things that they want in the Q&A, but they seem to be the top four that come out all the time. And it's a little bit reflective of sort of Decky and Ryan's self-determination theory that really has at its heart that idea of sort of autonomy and relationships in terms of, the ability to move forward with something. I suppose that the truth of it is, if people didn't like change, then there's a possibility we could all still live in caves. So rather than it being change that people don't like, it's actually uncertainty and disruption. So I'm going to throw out a challenge to you as the next time you hear or find yourself saying that people don't like change, actually stop yourself for a moment and try and look into what's the disruption that this creates for you. Is it a values thing? Is it a practical thing? Is it an expense? So either financial or social or emotional for you in seeing it play out. So if I could change the world by people saying people don't like change, that would be a mission in life for me. So in terms of change, and we talked about how people frame change, people may have seen the transition curve before, sort of originated by Kubler-Ross, the idea of the transition curve. And this is sort of a version that really looks at, I suppose, thinking about when something changes, something's coming to an end. So the introduction of something new can mean the ending of something old. Now, if you've had agency and autonomy and it's your move, it can actually be a really exciting thing. But if all those things are missing, then all of a sudden endings can start to look a little bit more like this. Once again, it's that sort of how people cope and the distraction and impairment of people's capacity to concentrate can then sort of lead to something like this. So you see a natural dip in where people are at, confusion, some anger, frustration, some optimism can start creeping in there, and then sort of to new beginnings. But it's one of the things I find in people managing change. And I think one of the earlier questions we had is, when leading or managing a group of people through change, my tip for managers and people leading, or it could be an organisation or a volunteer group that you're in, oftentimes people think they need to be flying the flag at new beginnings, going, come on, this will be great. You're better off actually going through the curve with people, stepping, meet people where they're at, step through them. Okay, it may not seem great at the moment. Tell me more about that. What is it that you think you might lose out of this? What are the challenges you envisage facing? These are some of the behavioural things that you can see, and some of the things you might hear also as people go through this. So it's really important to listen and observe as people go through change. And of course, this dip is what you really need to kind of be looking out for, and seeing what people, just what is different. If someone's always quiet and they're quiet through change, then that's sort of not particularly different for them. But it's when you start to sort of, if they start to become withdrawn as well as quiet, then it's a bit of a red flag for people. What's important to remember is that, we often have a response to something, and a person's reaction is their immediate appraisal of the situation. And sometimes that can be emotionally driven, and we'll look at that when we look at the instincts in just a moment. But it's how somebody responds following that makes the difference. So that's the bit to kind of concentrate on. If somebody rolls their eyes or takes a gasp or whatever, don't automatically label them as resistant, because if you label them as that, you're likely to treat them like that, and that's how they'll respond. So it's like, oh, hang on, I noticed, and sort of, looking at the behaviour, okay, that looks like it's not sitting well with you. Tell me more about it. What's going on there? What are you anticipating? Is really important. The other thing is that people can be on that curve, and this is, an interesting one when you're leading teams through change, is that people will be on the curve at different stages, at different times. People repeat parts of the curve. They might sort of be coming to, grips with the fact that things are ending. They're getting into some optimism, but then they go, oh, hang on a second, I didn't realise that. It's bigger than I thought. And then they sort of go back to, oh, okay, life as I know it's about to change again. So, or as new plans come out in projects, that's always a really interesting one. I often hear that we're building the plane as we're flying it. Sometimes you find out you're actually, building a boat. So, you have to be able to work with people on that, and it's almost like back to square one. But it's also about going, well, what did we learn last time? What are the strengths? What did we realise about ourselves? People will exhibit different emotions as we go through change. Teams some might travel the curve together, but they'll have beginnings in their own way and at their own time. So what I'd like to go through now is this idea of the framework, and you can find out more information at Hardwired Humans. This particular instinct, also this framework of instincts, was the work of Professor Nigel Nicholson of the London Business School, where he sort of looked at organisations and sort of seen these, I suppose, repeated patterns. So similar organisations having, different organisations having the similar problem. The common denominator was people, and what were we seeing as sort of the core behaviours and the sort of these repeated patterns. And that's really what human instincts is, and the fact that we're a social species, and human beings are statistical learners. Like, we look for patterns. It helps us make sense of our world. It helps us to process information more quickly. So, understanding the patterns. And that's really what change introduces, is that disruption is, you're messing with my pattern, man. So, it's about how do we go, well, how do we form a new pattern out of this? It doesn't necessarily have to stop, but it needs to morph into something else. So knowing about instincts gives us a predictive framework to help us make sense of what we experience. Each of the 9 instincts have the potential to be used in ways that either get us closer to or further away from where we want to be in time. And I suppose one of the things, particularly for leaders of change, is it's a natural obligation. It's inherent in your role as a leader to help people through change. But conventional thinking, is around people resist change. And as we just saw, well, actually, no, it depends. And really, good change management is about, and your role is, how do we create the conditions for this to be successful? How do we create the conditions for people to adapt? How do we create conditions for people to form new patterns? Sometimes they will be with you. Sometimes it will be, about going, well, actually, maybe your pattern's not with us any longer. Is that really your true pattern in life? And those can be very interesting conversations. So the thing, as we're going to go through, is sort of just explaining all these particular instincts. So the first one is around social belonging, and I thought I'd use a great graduate photograph here. And the thing is, as I was saying, human beings are a social species. We desire strong bonds with people. There'll be people who you went to uni with, there'll be people that went to school with, people you play sport with, online forums, all sort of a range of things. We tend to sort of find groups. I found this one really interesting. And there was a question earlier around retirees, where an organisation that had a lot of people with sort of long-term within an organisation, but nobody actually wanted to leave. And so, in some of those situations, performance wasn't quite where it was, but enough to kind of get through. And to sort of kickstart this idea about it's okay to leave, they started going, well, if we run this early retirement, or not early retirement, if we run this retirement scheme, what we're going to do is we're going to host a lunch every 3 months, just to bring you all back together. And it was quite interesting how they sort of worked with this instinct of social belonging, because if I've walked through the door for 30 years and seen this, these are my people, to suddenly not have that is a massive change, particularly when we crave it. So it's about thinking about how can we create those social connections. The other thing around social belonging, and you'll see it, and I've picked up this picture at Dark Mofo, is when it comes to like small groups, we tend to function in groups of around 7. So this can be, an interesting one if you're trying to get feedback on a change, or have sort of smaller conversations, because it's almost like that magic number of 7 plus or minus 2 is that we function best in that size group. And sort of in terms of sort of family groups and clans of around 150, there's some really interesting research that supports that. And, just looking at this one here, it's really interesting, it's these sort of like gossip size groups, and gossip is one of the instincts that we'll talk about. And, in a big cluster of people, we naturally morph into sort of small groups. You think about, you're out to a dinner party and you've got 12 people and you're going to have, at the head of the table, you've got a little cluster of 4 and people in the middle. We just naturally morph into those kind of groups. So really think about how you might use those kind of settings, particularly if you're wanting to have a conversation, thinking about large Zoom conversations. How do you break out rooms? Fantastic, and it can create some real social belonging as well. One of our other instincts is around loss aversion. And it's, I suppose it's part of our innate sense to survive, which means we seek to avoid loss and risky situations. The other thing is we're less likely to explore when we feel threatened, because what we're doing is we sort of start to conserve energy. Cortisol levels can rise, which sort of then starts to impact our ability for clear thinking, can impact our ability to, for language, because we're sort of channeling that resource somewhere else. So, when people are going through change, try to understand what is the potential loss here. And it's interesting because what you perceive as loss may be something completely different to someone else. And that's why I sort of like to use this example here of the Berlin Wall. And, one could think, how is unity loss? Great event in history, bring down the Berlin Wall. But looking at it through the perspective of these guys, the guards standing on the top, they're kind of like, hello, our job is to stand on the wall. And sorry, I don't mean to be glib about it, but, it's that this is our job. Really happy about freedom and unity, but I'm out of a job, and this is what feeds my family. So sometimes it's really important to really, change happens at an individual level. So it's important to kind of really get down to understand what it means for individuals. And believe me, the devil is always in the detail. And I'm sure there's plenty of people on this call that would probably agree with that as well. One of our other instincts is around emotion before reason, and there's sort of a bit of a biological driver on this one. It's almost like our first screening. In fact, it's been shown sort of the amygdala, which is often associated with emotional regulation, that when there's damage to the amygdala, that people have trouble making decisions. So it's almost like it's that sensory piece, that fight or flight. And, when people have a look at this image, it can suddenly be, oh, hang on, that looks a little bit creepy. What's that guy's intentions and all the rest of it. But, it's that first appraisal. So that might be a reaction. But then the response to the image often goes to, oh, hang on a second. Actually, I reckon he's in trouble. Other people look at this thing here, and I don't know what it is, but people then start to introduce information and go, well, there's cars in the background, so they've probably run out of petrol and that must be a fuel tank. So I always find it interesting how people kind of insert information here. But some of that is emotionally driven, because remember what I was saying around we're statistical, we're patterns, we try to make sense of the world. And in the absence of information, we tend to make it up. One of the other things, one of the other key instincts is around first impressions to classify, that moment of, oh, we need to talk. We classify situations. It's that almost like binary thinking to start with around, is it good or bad? Will it work? Won't it work? Any of those kind of binary kind of combinations. So, first impressions to clarify, oftentimes it can have a gut feeling as well. This one, I heard a great story and interested sort of in, what people think, but an announcement was made. It was on the Central Coast in New South Wales, and a small husband and wife team called an announcement on Friday afternoon and said to the staff, we want to catch up with you on Monday morning. Let's all meet in the staff room at 9 o'clock. Anyway, of course, lots of conversation went on over the weekend, and there were things like they're selling the business, there's a divorce on the wings, maybe they're having a baby. Not every immediate response is negative. But then the conversation that they had in the staff room on Monday morning is, what, we've had a cracking 6 months and our community's really contributed to that. So we're actually giving everybody, an amount of money to go and spend out in the community. And your job this morning is to go and spend that money as our way of saying thank you to the community. And I could almost guarantee that nobody thought that. So if we know that people will try to classify, it's really important when we share messages with people, try and almost keep it within the first 7 words. It's that immediate appraisal of the situation. We've got great news to share with you and have a special task Monday morning. Meet you in the crib room at 9 o'clock. So, that kind of thing to sort of flip the conversation. The other thing around first impressions to classify is it can also be about gut feel. And this is an example of sort of the Taj Mahal Palace in Mumbai in 2008, where Mike Smith, who was the CEO of ANZ, there was something about it where he went, no, I'm going to go to the airport early. And it was a really good thing that he did. He just declined to stay for a drink and sort of he went. So, and it could be those really simple things like staff members in corridors. It's a really friendly hotel, but there's just been some people who haven't looked me in the eye. So people pick up on things that and our behaviour really on a really sort of subconscious kind of level. So you might think that you're able to fake it, but somehow the world has a way of sort of sorting itself out. This next one here is oftentimes when it comes to first impressions to classify is you get this us and them effect. Who's our in-group, who are our allies, and people sort of classify, friend or foe, which is another one, particularly in times of threat. My advice around that one is actually focus on what unites us. It's not whether you can, I was going to say leap tall buildings, but I think that's wrong. Superhero, but it's kind of speed really fast in a car or climb a building with webs. It's actually what our combined strength is. We're superheroes. So how do we actually work and create a network that can sort of get us through this change? And this one here around the roller coaster, this is sort of the change curve again, but these are some different ways that, and things that people will classify particular moments. As we manage people through change, and it's also, there's a responsibility to kind of go, actually, this isn't for me. I've been in situations where people will have those conversations and they're telling everybody else, and it's like, well, hang on a second, you're not telling yourself that, like what needs to happen for you to be happy? And that's often a question that I'll ask people as well. Another instinct is around gossip. We talk, it's what separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. We have the power of language. We seek and share information. Sometimes people will gather together. We like to build alliances with people. We love to tell and share stories. And the more personal you can make it and the more relevant, rather than a series of facts, is like, actually, what's the experience been for you? So, that's a really good tip for with your teams, is kind of actually saying, what, I'm actually finding this really confusing at the moment. What I'd like to do is work with you to go, what are the questions we need answers to try and get some clarity here? The other one here is around empathy and mind reading. Humans, we tend to tap into people. Some people are really empathic and, they're able to sort of pick up on stuff. But the other thing is that sometimes we're projecting our own feelings into things. And this is one where I see where people have empathy and kind of go, oh, we can't tell them that because it'll really upset them. And it's like, if it's real, we need to tell them and we need to be honest. And I'll often hear the word, how do we couch this? You've got to be thinking about, particularly if you're working with adults, is like, let them decide how they feel about it. Just be really honest. It's that sort of do it with integrity, do it with respect, and, allow time for that person to be able to respond, because it's also about how we maintain relationships. So, sometimes stop and ask yourself, am I not asking it because I don't want to feel bad about telling them? So in all sort of change situations, you've got to take a back seat and think about who are the people that you're working with and what do they deserve is an important one. One of my favorite ones in change is confidence before realism. And I've used this one here because I saw it the other day. It came through on a university about some research that came out around preparedness of hikers and by 3 academics here at the university. So what they found was that people who, and I'm sort of inserting here, but the reality is sort of people who were doing shorter trips were less likely to be prepared. But the reality is that weather conditions can change really suddenly. And a lot of people kind of go, oh, I don't need it. You know, it's unnecessary, because there's this kind of, you know, puff up, look big, this effect of, you know, confidence before realism in things. The other thing it can often do is, particularly timelines, is, oh, don't worry, they'll be fine with it. Oh, don't worry, we'll manage it before then. So timelines are a really important one. So if we need to go around and actually have individual conversations with people, sometimes you've got to get down and actually work through the maths to go, if I'm spending 20 minutes with 130 people, we're actually talking about a 2-week process here. I've got to allow for the fact that some people aren't there. So, you know, really it's about, you know, is that realistic? And it can be a really good question to ask, particularly in project planning or change management planning, is how realistic is that? You know, and is that sort of confidence before realism speaking? I worked in an organisation where that actually sort of became part of the language. Now, the last example is around underestimating something. This is an example where actually confidence before realism came into play, and sort of thinking about the crash on the Hudson River, where, you know what, in all reality, the likelihood of landing on a plane on a river and nobody dying is pretty low. But actually having confidence in the training and the manuals and the automatic pilot, kind of, pardon the pun, but the ability to actually, we know the process in the event that this happens. So really good in change to have an if-then plan. If this happens, then we do this. Because remember what I was saying about emotion before reason, is that it can start to interfere with our judgment, because we're not processing with the, you know, that reason and rational part of our brain. We're sort of in that sort of limbic kind of thinking, that reactive kind of thinking, that autonomic thinking. So it can be a really good one to, you know, think through the what ifs before you go into any kind of change. Contest and display. Human beings, we're a social species. We seek to impress others. We like to sometimes carve out our own little niche. We're a social belonging, but, you know, we still have an identity that we want to maintain. I love this photograph, these graduates, you know, and, you know, sometimes it ensures our survival too, you know, when we impress other people and sort of demonstrate our worth and our means. Impression management often plays out here. The way that I can sort of see contest and display sometimes portray is that, you know, it's that contest piece that before change, you know, people talk about them and they, and it's a very kind of dissociated type of language. But, you know, as people kind of get on board and they're starting to feel more comfortable, it becomes we and us and how about, and sort of, you know, you sort of really hear that language change. So, you know, some people do it, words get bigger, body language gets bigger, you know, I call it the puff up and look big scenario. The final instinct is around hierarchy and status. You know, I just think university graduations are a good way of doing that, because, you know, it's our regalia. It shows where things are, but we're a social species and we like to know where we sit within a hierarchy, and humans either seek superiority or security within the system. So, you know, we seek status of symbols and elevation. Some people are where it means more to them than others. And I think when we talk about hierarchy and status, it's not always about being the boss. Sometimes it's about being known as the go-to person. An example of this is putting in a new system where, you know, people have worked with it for 30 years are the go-to people, put in a brand new system, and all of a sudden they know no more than the person who's been there 3 weeks. So it's like, how can we honour, you know, the status and the hierarchy of people who've been there for 30 years? Do we train them first and use them to sort of train other people? So, you know, this is about, if we know these things exist, we know that people might, you know, use some contest and display to challenge the hierarchy, then work with it, you know. That's, I suppose, what we think about with the instincts. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and we're going to be able to, I'm happy sort of to provide the slides, but really thinking about, you know, these 9 essentials for leading change, you know, analyse philosophersion, really influence the classifying moment. You know, what's the compelling reason? Try not to sell the reason, like actually be very genuine and authentic around it. this first 7 words really get to the heart of what is it, that classification moment. People, all they're thinking is good or bad. You want to be able to help them understand that straight away. Gossip and rumour. People talk, we need to, and when I say gossip, I don't necessarily mean malicious. It just means people are testing ideas. This is where some bias can come into it as well. But people will fill vacuums. Think about the gossip test. What is it we want people to say after this? Repeated messages, key messages are really, really important. Particularly in change, you start to hear the language come back at you. I always love listening to how other people frame it, and they'll use their words rather than sort of trying to come up with my own little catchphrase or something like that. Manage to the individual level is really important. Think about dynamics and changes in social groups, and really attend to derailers is a really important one. Just one thing around emotions, and I might skip through a couple because I'm just sort of looking at time. The thing we need to remember about emotions is they're transient, so no emotion lasts forever. So in those moments where you think, I'm really angry, it's like, you're not going to be like that forever. So understand why you're angry. What are you actually angry about? It's different to mood. So, in terms of like a low mood, it's usually much milder and much longer lasting. Emotions affect how we process information. And the other thing is it's more than feelings, because people often, talk about, oh, that emotional, it's that touchy-feely stuff. And it's a whole body experience. And the effects on our body can actually have an impact to, our sleep and all of those kind of things, our sleep, our, gut health, all of that. And the other thing is that emotions are contagious. So really be thinking about how you practice emotions. Now, what I just want to look at here really quickly is just an emotional check-in. So this is sort of using, when we talk about emotional intelligence, these 5 subscales, if you like, but, your ability to adapt is really thinking about, well, what's your self-perception? Some check-in questions might be, well, rather than beat yourself up, ask yourself, what are my strengths? Is there an opportunity to learn here? How do I behave when I feel vulnerable? Am I displaying those things now? Self-expression, how you express yourself to other people. And these are all sort of interlinked around how you perceive yourself. I'm no good at this, or I'm brand new to this, plays out into how you may express yourself, as in, oh, my opinion's not worth it, which affects your interpersonal relationships, which might impact decision making, and you sort of might make it about other people instead of you. And then, that plays out into our stress management. So, what responses are most likely help the person understand where I'm coming from? Is there anything that I'm doing that could be perceived as more sort of aggressive than assertive? it really takes a level of self-awareness. What questions can I ask that will help me understand this person's response? It's that Covey principle around seek to understand. What helped me. But as I said, happy to provide these, but the tips there are really around remind yourself that support's available. Sometimes you've got to be prepared to accept and reframe. It's that 3 bucket theory of what's within my control. These are the things I can act on. What can I influence? And then what are the things that are outside my control? And they're really the things that accept the fact that this could work. Okay, imagine if it worked. Project myself 10 years into the future and it's all fantastic. What would I want it to look like? Be curious, ask questions to clarify. Don't just come up with a classification, or if you do, check in that you're actually correct. Break things down into bite-sized chunks. That's, anxiety 101 is around how do we break things down into bite-sized chunks. Help create solutions. Sleep and eating routines are really, really important. How do you get the oxygen flowing through your blood, to be able to feed your brain? Our brain is processing even when we're asleep. So it's really important to have that downtime. And this last one here is around be kind to yourself is really, really important also. So I might just stop sharing there so we've got some time for questions.
Thanks, Suellen. That was wonderful, and I really appreciate actually the clarity of your slides as well. So just for everyone who's on the call, and for those actually after, you can revisit this presentation on our YouTube channel, we'll send you directly the links to those. So, Suellen, thank you for offering to share. You already are sharing, and lots of people will have access to them. So it's great that people can revisit them and with your commentary. So that's great. So coming to the questions, we did have some in advance, and I'll perhaps tackle a couple of those. Craig, I think you're in good shape, because I think most of the point about your question has been answered. Craig asked a question about any advice for navigating change when leading or managing a group. And I think, Craig, what you got there was some really great tips and advice there, thinking about those sort of groups of 7, that sort of gossip stuff, and how to actually use that to an advantage. Those 9 instincts, really helpful, and sort of understanding that transition curve. So Craig, do go back and look over the slides. I think you've got heaps there around helping to manage leading or managing change in a group. A couple of questions have come in, Suellen, and I wonder if we can just look at these that actually relate to the question of age. So you did talk about retirees. One question is, what advice do you have for reluctant retirees? So when you spoke about this in your presentation, you gave some helpful insights as to, as an organisation, what you could do to help those individuals manage change. But this particular question comes from the angle of, well, if you are that retiree, what could the individual do? And perhaps, you know, especially when we think about COVID, that people have perhaps expedited and not necessarily of their own accord retirement plans. So do you have any advice for the individual for whom that change has occurred and not necessarily in that time frame that they were necessarily looking for?
Yeah, and I think it'd be, you know, what is the difference that it made? And I think sometimes when we talk about change, sort of retirement is a trigger. So oftentimes we think of that trigger as the change, but it's actually what's different because of that change. And it's really about addressing those things that are different. And it's thinking about, what is the pattern that I want to establish? You know, am I missing the social connection with people? Are there ways that I can give back to the community? So, you know, belonging to different groups, that feeling of altruism is really important as well, because the other thing is it produces a hormone called oxytocin, that sense of bonding, because we can feel quite isolated if we're sort of no longer in that workplace. So anything that sort of is creating that sense of feel good and altruism is a really good one in there as well. But it's also sort of getting to the heart of, you know, in terms of your values, you know, have they changed? You know, what are the things that you can do now? Just take work out of the equation, but what are other ways that you can express and learn to understand your own identity as well? So, and there's some great work around identity.
Thank you. Another sort of age-related one is, and I'm thinking back to the comments that you made earlier in your presentation around understanding the difference between change and not liking disruption. But do older generations, an older demographic, find it harder to respond to change than other age groups, Suellen? Because again, that's something we all fall into, assuming that that's the case, but perhaps it's not. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's that sort of classifying moment, isn't it? We start to see these human instincts come out, where we classify and go, oh, you know, people don't adapt to change, you know, they're too set in their ways. The wonderful thing about the brain is it's really plastic, or the plasticity they talk about. But what the research tells us around what is the effect of age on change is really more that older people tend to focus on emotionally meaningful goals rather than sort of some of those more in attainment and that hierarchy and status. So it's sort of, does it have that sort of emotional meaning for them? And they're more likely to adopt acceptance as a form of emotional regulation. So in terms of that, you know, how do I cope with this? Is sometimes they will actually just comply. And, you know, particularly when it comes to high conflict situations, so sort of avoiding conflict in that. So, you know, particularly if you're working with older people, it's really making sure that they've got a voice in that, and sort of, you know, so what are your thoughts on that, you know, and what's the impact for you? So that tends to be for older people, is that it's more that emotionally meaningful goals and sort of that conflict avoidance.
So one question that's come in from a member of our community, from Greg, I wondered whether it challenges the notion of that when subjected to change, that emotion comes first and then you kind of apply a sort of rational thought process afterwards. He's referenced the fact that having read the the sort of much in the press at the moment, Richard Flanagan's book Toxic, found himself having, I think as you describe it, an emotional reaction. So both the sort of beyond feelings, actually also a sort of very physical response that really has challenged, some fundamental views. So that because the book presents Tasmania as being politically and commercially corrupt state, and that if that's true, it's incredibly confronting and challenging, he found, because the notion this presents a notion of a state who doesn't actually respect the health and long-term stability of its citizens or its environment. So something might read a book and you think you're going to approach this with a sort of rational head, and to then find you have this incredibly emotional response. He's asked a question around, well, how does he respond to that? It's just fundamentally changed his view about what the state might actually be about.
Yeah, and look, I'll tell you what, it's a really interesting question. And I suppose if we're thinking about advice, my advice would actually be to talk about it with somebody else. If it's really had that sort of that visceral effect, it's really affecting you, because that can have a physical and a mental effect. So, talk it through with somebody. One of the things that I tend to do is really try to understand what it is about this, has a value that I have around, honesty and integrity sort of turned into a rule, as in you can't lie. And it's like, well, reality is people make stuff up, and so that's that, being prepared to reframe, the Tasmania that you're in love with before, but for that scenario, does that other stuff still exist? Yeah, there's wonderful people doing wonderful things, go and expose yourself to some of the wonderful research that's coming out of Tasmania, and really thinking about, some of those, those social activities that happen. So, it's kind of, is there corruption in the world? Yes. So it's about being prepared to accept those things you can't change. But, I'd be sort of wanting to tease out what was it about it that really kind of resonated, and it sort of sounds more in that values kind of space. What was the values button, and sort of, have they broken a rule, but how can you turn that value back to kind of go, well, hang on, I value integrity. So what am I doing to actually demonstrate that? Where have I seen it demonstrated, just to remind yourself that it still exists.
Mm-hmm. Another question that perhaps relates to the state, if there's some might be a very tangential sort of link here between those two questions, but Michael has asked that he says that during the pandemic last year, initially there was a fear of telling everyone all the facts because it'd be too scary for people to perhaps to cope with, but later on state primaries decided to tell everyone all the facts and why decisions around lockdowns were arrived at, keeping everyone fully in the loop. We've had a continuous news cycle about this kind of stuff. Do you have a view about what the right strategy is, or that just reflects the view that state leadership recognises people have gone on that transition curve, if you like, and so can cope with more information?
Yeah, and human beings have an amazing capacity to cope. We've just got to let them, and sometimes it's about how you classify that moment. And I've seen oftentimes it's done with really good intent, and people get this feeling like you're holding something from me. But yeah, it's really about keeping it at facts. What are the impacts for that? If we don't know the impacts, what do we anticipate that might be? So I think never underestimate people's ability to cope. Just make sure you're doing it with respect and integrity, and don't try and be tricky. People have a really good way of working it out. And when in that threat state, the whole radar's really on. So treat them like adults and not like children. Give them the information that they can do stuff with.
It's interesting. There's a couple of questions that sort of seem to me to be at sort of two ends of a spectrum. So Susan asked a question around how can those who have little power influence those in authority to make positive changes within institutions. So how can the smaller voice actually have influence? So I guess this can be where people perceive change to be unavoidable, and that the voice of the individual doesn't appear to be being heard. Is there anything that people can do to kind of have their voices heard more effectively?
Yeah, and I think it's about it's a great question, and sometimes you've got to balance it with that. what are the things I can control? What are the things I can influence? And it might be you may not control the output, but what can I influence? And I'll give a really great example of, a team that thought, nobody understands what we do, like they're imposing this change, but nobody really understands what we do. So they got really creative about it, and they made a video, invited, sort of senior people along, and then played this video that was kind of choreographed with all the different things that happened. You had social setting, it was around food, there was conversation, and they got to portray themselves in a way that was natural for them because it was a creative group. And what they had known was that they had done their best to be able to do that. And, if I can sort of channel Fitzsimmons for just a minute, the ex-fire chief, I remember him saying once that I may not, I serve many masters and I may not be, I won't always get my own way. And, all I can do is provide the advice. But by the time I've walked out of that room, nobody's in any doubt about how I feel. So, you may not be the decision maker, but just go, have I done what I can to at least express myself, even if it's an email or crafting it, is there a creative way that we can do this? So it doesn't have to be adversarial, but it's like, have I done what I can? And if you think, I have no power or no right to do that, then you'll probably behave in that way. But it's like, actually, this is a change that's impacting me. I just want to share what this means for me. Don't make it about judgment. You're doing this all wrong. No one's going to read that well. But, it's that this is the situation. This is the impact on me. This is what I'm noticing. It would be better if.
That's interesting. I like the idea of the video. That's very creative.
Yeah.
I guess the other end of the spectrum, or the flip side to that kind of question, is somebody who is asking, if you're somebody who's leading change, and let's make an assumption that this individual who's asking this question is really following all the kind of best practice around change management. But does it come a point at which you've got people who simply will not accept the change, or is not going to be party to the change in some way? And so I guess presumably are being in some ways could be being disruptive or negatively influencing others. Is there a point at which you just have to let that go? I mean, again, you can't always get everybody on side, even if you followed best practice, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And another great questions, by the way, everyone. I hope I'm answering them. But I think it's about that reality checking, and reality checking is very important for emotional regulation. And, I've had a conversation with someone around, they're going, but this is happening and that's happening. It's like, yes, it is. So this environment is not going to change. So what you have to work out is, can you work within it? Now that's your choice. And if your answer is no, then to me, it doesn't make sense to keep doing that. What are the options that are open to you? So, and this person was like, are you telling me to leave? And it's like, no, I want you to be happy. And what I want you to do is pick an environment where you can work, because this was actually a social issue. And it's like, well, that's not going away. So you're the point of control here. So you work out we do. Anyway, a couple of days later, she sent me a message going, thanks, really sort of recognize what I need to do now. So sometimes it's actually about having those hard questions,
So Ellen, we do have it's still 2 or 3 questions to go. We've run out of time, but I'm going to finish with one because I think it is one that's highly topical, and then I've got a bit of a quick wrap up to do. But it seems a good question to end. Do you think that the pandemic has helped us respond to change better? I mean, it's a huge generalization, but has it given society greater courage and adaptability, do you think?
Actually, another great question. My response is, I think what it did is it highlighted the adaptability that we have. I don't think it made it better at it. It just gave us an opportunity to really demonstrate it. So yeah, that would kind of be my response to that question.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks also for that being a quick response too, because I do want to try and end up being on time. But I've really enjoyed that, Sue Ellen. I think there's something for everyone there, whether you're working in an organisation, whether you're an individual responding to change within an organisation, or even in your personal life. Huge. We all experience change on a regular basis. So some great tips and reflections there. Thank you so much. So I will ask people just in your own way to quietly, silently thank Suellen, for your presentation. We've really enjoyed that today. Thank you. And it's a really good example of the expertise that we have here amongst our alumni community, and we've been very pleased to be able to bring all of that expertise and insight to you today. So the recording of this presentation will be available soon via our YouTube channel, and you can access that through the Explore website, and the link is now also on your screens. You'll also soon get an invitation to join another engaging webinar, which is next going to take place on Tuesday, the 27th of July, and that's with Imogen Wegman, an alumna and lecturer in history and classics, and she's going to help us explore family history, and I know that's a very hot topic amongst our alumni community. So she will offer insights to assist us in researching our family's past, why it's important, and tips to develop our skills and knowledge. So all that's left for me to say is that if you have any topics, or indeed if you think that you have something to offer our alumni community, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Please reach out to the team via the contact details on your screens. So that's it, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good rest of the day wherever you may be.